1995, we are interviewing Mrs. Rose Fogel in her home in Whitestone, New York, United States of America. After the Germans came into Lodz, what were the first consequences? Can you tell us about it?
Yes. Prior to their approach to Lodz, the Poles ordered the young men to dig ditches to hide in case, ditches for against the airplanes. And throughout the city, ditches were dug. Now, the first thing the Germans did when they came in is call the Jews to cover them up. The next thing they did, they blew up the synagogues. Within days, this happened so fast, it just, every day there was another order. Now, to do this, they would take the young men, older men, any men, they take them to do the demolition. And some people who weren't even able to go were forced out by force. They were taken by force. They took my grandfather, who had a long beard, to do this kind of work. In the process, they pulled his beard and cut off half of it, so to poke fun at him. Of course, he was a very religious man, and to him this was a terrible blow. After that, he put a scarf around his neck so he couldn't be seen without half a beard missing. The next step was simply torturing people, like I just said about my grandfather. They took my brother to work. My brother was 19 years old. And they made him do very heavy physical work, digging ditches, covering up, and he was beaten up very badly. As a matter of fact, he came home bleeding from his head, and my mother was heartbroken over this. And when he came home, he decided that he does not want to stay any longer. He wants to run away. The trend was to go east. And he started to plan this, but that created a terrible atmosphere in our house because he was the oldest, he was the only brother, and of course my mother was very fond of him, and she was very much against it. But seeing how he was reacting, he just couldn't take it. And she saw him coming home bleeding, and she said, "Now, I can't stop you anymore. Go." So he started to plan. He made maps, and he got together with 5 of his friends, and they decided to go to Russia. At that time, we were wearing, when they marched in, we had to wear armbands, yellow armbands, the Star of David. A few weeks later, they changed it and made us wear a Star of David on the chest. My brother took off his armband and went to the train. We didn't even see him off because it was too dangerous. So he went to Russia. And we lived with the illusion that he was safe. In the meantime, the situation became tense. Every day there were new orders, new persecution orders. The money had lost its value, the paper money, and you couldn't buy anything for it, so as a result people went hungry. I had saved up in my lifetime silver coins, which I intended to buy myself a watch, and I kept it in a little matchbox. I had 20 zlotys, so I felt that this was the time to give it to my mother. I gave her the 20 zlotys, and she cried and she said, I really don't want to take it from you, but hoping after the war I will give it back to you, I'll pay it back to you. It was every day another threat. You were not safe to go out into the streets. There was no bread, so there were bread lines. Now, in the bread lines, if you lined up and you had a Jewish face, you were picked out and taken out of the line. Naturally, I was always the first one to go because I had a Jewish face. Ironically, it wasn't the Germans that recognized us as Jews, it was the Poles. They could tell who was a Jew. So we had to try and do it any other way. My sister was blonde, and she was able to get some bread. In general, you couldn't work anymore. Whatever my father's customers, who were German, had turned against us, so there was no work. And there were rumors that there's going to be a ghetto. The rumors came first. Next came 10 hours. And then it was just an hour, get out. We couldn't take anything with us. Just the bare essentials, the clothes we wore on our backs, nothing else, get out. We had to go to the ghetto in a different section of the city, which was, before the war, it was called Balut. It was a slum, and that's where they planned to have the ghetto. So this was already in January of 1940. And we went to the ghetto, but we had no place to go. So we went for the first night just to have a place to get into, to an uncle of my mother, the great uncle, and they were a family of 7, and we were a family of 5, and we all got together, and everybody was one on top of the other in that one single room. So the following day, my father went out, and he bought a room from a Christian woman who had to leave the ghetto so we could get in. And we moved into that room. Now, the ghetto was still open for a few months, for I think until March. In March, the ghetto was officially closed, which meant we could not go in and we could not get out. There were wire fences put around the city, put around the ghetto, and the ghetto was established. Now, before the war, the Jewish community had a council, a Jewish community council. When the Germans marched in, they designated the person who was from the community council spoke German, and they picked him to be the Älteste der Juden, which is the president of the ghetto, because it became like a government. He was a man who ran an orphanage before the war, and he was a very well-known personality in Lodz. Everybody looked up to him, and I suppose he was capable of the position. Coming to the ghetto, he became like a king. He laid down the laws. He drove around in a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage with bodyguards around him, and he formed a community council in the ghetto. Now, we had everything like another government would have. Money was printed in the ghetto. We had a post office, we had a fire department, we had jails, we had a court, we had post office, we had a health department, everything that a government would have. However, not everybody had a job. And in order to be in the ghetto, you had to be employed. So my father had a lot of acquaintances before the war. And he spoke to them, and they offered him a job as a policeman. And he turned it down. Even so, it carried a stigma, because you could make more money, get a ration, extra ration, and you were looked up to. But that was not my father's thing, so he turned it down, and we were without any financial or physical, whatever. We didn't get anything. So again, somebody offered him a job in the Board of Health, and he took that job. Next came my mother, had to be employed. But we couldn't see my mother going to work. She was, even so, she was only in her early 40s. But she never worked in her life, and it was just not possible for her. She was not well either. She had a kidney condition. So if you gave away a sewing machine, you could get a job in a factory. And we had a sewing machine. So she gave away the sewing machine so that my sister could get a job, not my mother. My sister got the job for the sewing machine. Then my other sister got another job through a friend of my father in a factory where they made wooden toys, not for the ghetto children. The wooden toys, it was exported to Germany. The ghetto was exporting whatever was being produced to Germany. Now, I got a job working in a leather good factory. I made the upper part from the shoe. I would glue it together, and working at night, I sometimes fell asleep. I worked 12 hours. If I worked the night shift, I would doze off working. But everybody had to be working. But then we still had a problem with my mother. She had no job. And the danger was that if you did not work, you were sent out. So they had something what they gave you work to do from home. At first, she got cigarettes to roll. So we took the work home, and when we came home from our jobs, we did her job. But that ran out, that factory closed, and again she was unemployed. So they had another job, which was making braided rugs. We had to braid from fabrics. Now it was like the Jews in Egypt. They told her to make the rug, but they did not give her the fabric. So we tore up everything that we had, the sheets and everything from the house. And when we ran out of material, we had to start looking. So I went to look for the material. I heard that there was a lot of clothes brought into the church in the city. The church was in the ghetto. And to my horror, when I came in to see what was going on there, were mountains of clothes lying on the ground. And when I started to look, I had little understanding of what these clothes were. I just thought that what I can get out of it to make strips. But when I started to look for the strips, I realized some of it was bloody. I soon found out that those were clothes that were sent in to the ghetto from the people who were killed in Chelmno.
Can you spell it, please?
Chelmno. Chelmno is a city, a village rather, not far from Lodz. And as soon as the ghetto started, they started to send people away. Because the same time we came in, 250,000 of us came to the ghetto. In addition to the fact that we were 250,000, 20,000 came from Germany. Another 20,000 came from Austria. Then people came from Luxembourg, they came from Belgium, they came from all over. And in order to balance off, they sent in those people and they took out the others. At first, they sent them to working camps. They were told that they're going to working camps, and some of them volunteered because they felt that they would better themselves. But eventually, we realized that it wasn't just a voluntary thing, that they were going to work in factories. So people started to hide to try to avoid being caught. They would catch people in lines waiting for bread. They took people out of jobs. They walked in and took people away. So after that, we knew that something, we really didn't know where they're going or what is happening to them. We just knew it's not a good thing, and people tried to avoid it. And this went on and on constantly until 1942. This is an incident that will stand out in my mind for the rest of my life, because I had a little cousin who was born in 1937. He was 5 years old. And the order was that they would take children and old people. And I had my grandfather. We also had this little cousin. And we had to try to save them. In order to save them, you had to run over rooftops. After they came to one house and left, the Germans came, made a selection, took away the people, and then they would leave, go on to the next one. Now we would watch out and see if they left the building, we'd run to another one, and it meant running at night. Well, it was a terribly, terribly sad situation because we didn't want to give up our grandfather. We knew that leaving him meant death. We also knew that there was this child, that we had to save the child. So we very, very reluctantly, my mother had to go and say goodbye to her father. We left my grandfather, and our family and my aunt with her child. We ran to another building. We went to a cousin of my mother's. And when we came into that house, there was the cousin standing and crying with her husband. They had just taken away her 6-year-old child. And here we come in with a child. I stood the whole night long at the window crying. I just couldn't cope with the situation. I was terrified that we're going to lose it. This was my favorite cousin. And I looked at that child. We had trained him to hide from the Germans. We were hiding in attics. We were hiding him. And he knew that he's supposed to go into a box and cover himself when the Germans came. And they used to come from house to house, and we knew they're coming to our house, and when they walked into the building, they would start screaming and shouting and sometimes shooting in the air. So we knew it was going to happen, and then we would go up to the attic and close. My father had improvised some kind of a contraption to close the door with a bookcase. And our family, my aunt's family, we would sit there and look down and see the selection, how they picked out the younger ones and the older ones, left, right. And I was so happy we had this child, that we were able to save him. And we stayed there all night. After that, we came back to our room, and my grandfather was gone. The neighbors told us that they came, they picked him up, and they put him on a wagon. And when he was in the wagon, he asked the neighbor to bring his skull cap because his head was bare. He was very religious. He wanted to cover his head with it. And
what month and year did this take place?
What months of the year? It was August 16th.
Of 40?
Not August, I'm sorry, it was September 16th of 1942. Prior to this, I sat at the bedside of my grandfather's wife. She was my step grandmother, and I tried to comfort her when she was dying, and she died in my hands. She died of starvation. I watched her, and she was quite aware of what's going on, and her only worry was who's going to take care of grandfather. And I told her that I would. At the age of 13, I felt quite grown up. And she just closed her eyes and died. And after that, we did take care of my grandfather. He came to live with us. There were many other deaths in the family. My uncles died, 4 of them. My best friend died. She was only 18. She died of TB. There was starvation going around, and people were falling like flies. You would walk out in the street, and you would see corpses lying there, sometimes frozen, and nobody even bothered to pick them up because there were so many. People were brought in from the small towns. They, excuse me, they liquidated the small towns around Lodz, and they brought the people into the city. Now, those people had already gone through a selection, lost most of their families, and they came in, mostly young men and women. And when they came in, we had to make room for them. And we had to put them up, help them out, and look for jobs. There was a trick about it. The Germans had a trick. They brought them in, supposedly to stay in the ghetto. They stayed a few weeks, and they were the first ones to be sent out again. The people who volunteered to go to work in other cities were registered. So the family back home received a certain amount of money. All of a sudden, when they had to send people away, they took that list and they sent away all those people. They just disappeared. We know that eventually they all wound up in Chelmna. But it was very easy for them to get the list. They were getting money, and they sent them away. The ghetto in general was mostly starvation. It was a slow process. We were 5 years in the ghetto, and 5 years of starvation. Starvation and death and fear.
And your brothers died of starvation? Your 4 brothers died of starvation?
My uncles died of
Uncles.
starvation.